So I have my colour key for my paint, so I can easily go to the colours, and hopefully you've got one of these to hand, so when I mention the colours I'm using you can grab it. I'm going to pop that up there. I have a little reference photo. I have a little reference photo, but I actually have it on an iPad in front of me, the actual painting picture. So I've only using 3 brushes. I'm working, I think my paper is probably 8 by 10, and I'm working with larger rather than smaller brushes. I might use a finer one, but I'm going to start with the biggest one. But first of all, I'm going to draw out my image, and it's a very easy landscape. So I'm just looking at where the lines start. So I've got my hills up here. Nothing's in the middle, so be conscious of that. This is just below. So if my middle is here, and I can see that on my screen, then my green grass in the front comes across at an angle to about here. Then I've got my bushes which come across there. I'm going to ignore the cow. I've got this big bush here. In fact, I'm going to make that a bit bigger. And my tree, I am not going to put it in with paint until the very end, but I want to know whereabouts it is. Okay, and then in here I've got some dark bits, but I'm not going to worry about that yet. I'm just going to map in. These hills come down to almost the top of the tree. They go up again, up, and it doesn't matter, nobody knows what you're painting, what it really looks like, so don't be too worried about that. And that goes up there. So this is naturally nicely split into thirds, this landscape. You want your drawing to be very faint, and so once you've drawn it, you really want to just try and rub it back a bit with a gentle rubber, like a putty rubber or something. I'm not going to worry about that on mine because mine's really just for demonstration. I've got my 2 pots of water, one for dirty brushes so I can wash my brush out, one for dipping into clean water before I go into a new colour, and I've got my set of colours in a palette that I can also mix in. So these are the Meaden colours that I'm using. And before I do anything, I am going to mix up some colours that I want to be using during the whole thing. So I'm mixing up some lemon yellow, and I want a big inky pool of it. So if you've got the pans, it might take you a little while to get a big inky pool mixed up. It is easier, a little bit easier with the tube colours because they come out already fairly liquid. So lemon yellow, and then my more orangey yellow. I'm just mixing it up sort of so it's an ink-like mixture, and you may have to really scrub at your pans to get these. My next one is a blue, but I've just managed to get yellow in my mixing well, so I've got to clean that out. So I'm mixing up the colours that I want to use in my wash. So I want them a fairly inky consistency, and I'm going to be using them throughout the painting. So I can't mix up too much, because if it dries, if I don't use it, it dries and I can use it another time. So I've got a blue and 2 yellows. I'm also going to mix up some of my cerulean, which is your turquoisey blue. If you haven't got a cerulean, you might have a Prussian, but it's more of a greeny blue. So a bit of that. And then I'm also, actually I'm not going to do a pool of burnt sienna. So they're my key colours I'm going to start with. So I'm going to clean my brush off. And the first thing I'm going to do is just wet my sky, and I want it, in fact, use the bigger brush that you have. The bigger the better, because the more you can get on, the faster it dries. I've actually got some colour on this. So do as I say, not as I do. I've got my board at a slight angle, so you can see I've got this lovely bead of water coming down the page, and that will really help you. It really aids in getting the watercolour effect. And ideally you want to keep this bead moving when you're doing watercolour. It prevents things running back. And I'm coming just down to the top of the mountains, and I've made all of that wet. I'm now going to dry my brush off, and I'm just going to go in and pick up this extra water at the bottom, because I don't want it running when my paint goes into it. Dry my brush off each time, pick that bead of water up. Just these, if you're using good watercolour brushes, they will soak up the water. They should hold quite a bit of water. Right. Now I've got some of my cobalt. It's nice and inky. My paper's nice and wet, and it's not runny enough, so let's get some more water on that. And as it comes down, you want it darker than you think you do, because it will change as it meets with the water. It will dilute itself. So this is the turquoise, and I'm adding some in. I don't want to fiddle and faff too much with it, so I'm just letting it kind of do its own thing. And then I'm going to mix a bit of that turquoise with a tiny bit of burnt sienna or one of your browns. You don't want it to go green, so if it goes a bit green, just add in a tiny little bit of red, something reddy, because you want a nice cloud colour. So I'm just adding a little bit of blue, a little bit of brown, and I'm just going to drop a little bit of this in some areas, not everywhere, and try not to make it uniform. So I'm rolling my brush rather than, and the colour's actually changing. Look, this grey is going less warm as it gets lower down. And then I'm going to dry my brush out and just use it to pick out some clouds. And I'm rolling it again. Just give my sky a bit more texture. Wash my brush off, clean it up. Your skies are going to look different every time you do them, and it depends how much water you've got on your page as to what's going to happen. Right, so my paper is still a bit wet, so I can still afford to move some stuff around, but it's going to dry pretty soon. So So I don't really want to fiddle much more than that. I'll blend that out a little bit. So I'm going to leave it like that. Actually, I might just take out a bit more cloud over here. That's it. Right, but you've got to leave it because you keep fiddling because you want the sky to look good, and actually once all of this goes in, it's going to change it completely. So now I don't want to do anything where this line is wet because it will run, although it's quite dry there. So I'm going to try, I'm going to mix up a little bit of my rose. So if you've got a cool dark red, so alizarin or rose, a crimson of some sort, with my blue, which in my case is a cobalt, you might be using ultramarine, and then again I'm going to add in a teeny bit of burnt sienna just to dull it down a little bit, and I'm going to put some distant hills in, and I'm going to run it along the skyline because I'm quite happy if it, I don't want it to run, but I want it to soften. Right, so that's a little bit too mauve, so I'm going to add a bit more blue into that. And I want to soften that even more. I'm adding a tiny bit of the turquoise into that for some of the distant hills, and I'm going to add more water. And what I actually want in here is I want a bit of highlight as well. So I'm going to add in a tiny bit of yellow to this. So it's going to turn into a green, but it's quite subtle. And as it comes nearer the foreground, I'm going to brighten it up just a little so that it kind of peeks through. It's part of my tree, it's going to be in the background. Paint my tree over the top. So I'm going to bring it down a little bit. Also in here, I want to drop in a little bit of a darker blue, because in some of these areas you've got some shadows, darker marks. Don't want it too strong in colour because they're really just distant hills. And I can soften these off at another stage. I want some of this greeny yellow at the front. I've actually stopped that a bit too high up, so I'm going to bring my grass up a little higher. Bring it up there. Now in here I'm going to mix up, still using the yellow and the blues, but they're slightly different amounts of blue to yellow, and I'm going to start adding in some, dropping in some colour for these bushes at the front. It will run a little, but not, hopefully not too much. And I've got several colours in my brush at once, so I haven't mixed an entire colour. So I'm getting a bit of variegation. I've just run my brush through several colours. get my bushes. And there's a little bush in here. So I'm using, as you can see, my brush on the side. Okay. Now I've got a clean brush and I want to soften this mauve and this blue down behind this tree. I don't want it to disappear. But I want it to come in a bit more behind the tree. I don't want that such an obvious. I'm going to put that dark tree in, so I've got some very dark green. But these greens straight out of here are a bit false, so in order to improve that, I'm going to add a tiny little bit of raw sienna in. And again, using my brush one way. I don't want it to be all the same, so I'm putting a lighter colour in as well, also over here, and on this side I'm going to drop in a darker green made up with my blue, and in fact it's very dark, so I'm going to add in a tiny bit of black just to darken that. So it's the same green I've used, but before it's dry. And if you've done this class with me in person, you may notice I'm painting it in a slightly different sequence. And to be honest, I don't think there's a right or wrong way. It's a matter of preference. Right, so I'm happy with that. And I think probably in here we could have a little bit of darker, a few darker bushes and things behind to give a little bit more texture. Might notice I'm not painting the cow. Don't want to make life too difficult. And you might notice also I'm not painting it like it's like I'm drawing. I'm using my brush. On its side. That tree is too big, but I think maybe once this one goes in, we'll get away with that. So I'm going to try putting some of this in, and I don't want to make it too uniform, so I'm using the same colours. I've still got a bit of a mix of colours. I'm leaving gaps, if you can see, in between the trees. There are gaps in between the trees, in between the leaves and branches there are gaps. Comes down here. Gets quite heavy down here. I'm going to pick up a little bit more of the dark green and with some black in it, so I want it to be a very dark green, and I'm keeping my mixture fairly dry, and I'm just going to try and dry brush to pick out some of the darker areas of this tree. It gets darker and denser in the middle, as they usually do. And there's some darker and denser bits out here as well. And they kind of join up, but I want to leave some gaps. So I've got some soft and hard edges in there, you might notice. Okay, I think that's all right. I'm going to come down and do a bit more of the foreground. And in fact, I'm going to put some more kind of bushy things in here, more in the foreground, so they'll be slightly warmer. So I'm using my more orangey yellow and my blue that I used for the sky. I'm adding a little bit of lemon in as well to make it a little bit, I want it slightly different shade. Yeah, so it looks like 2 rows of bushes. Okay, and I'm going to do the same thing that I did in the background, and that is just drop in some darker colour. So I'm just mixing a little bit more blue into this. Doesn't look a very real colour, so I'm going to mix in a little bit of burnt sienna. It just greys it down, makes it look a bit more realistic, and it gives some varying shades. I don't want all my greens to look identical. So I'm actually going to try adding in a tiny bit of this phthalo green, but it's such a strong colour. I might regret that. Right, we could maybe get away with it in a couple of places. Alright, we'll see. I may have to lift out some of this tree on the left because I don't want it to look so kind of stark. It's a hard line, I don't want it to be a hard line. That's a very, very big tree. Okay, anyway. I'm going to do the same down here as I did. I'm not worried about this running, but similar to my background. So I'm going to allow that all to drift in. Make this wet, but not all of it. I'm going to leave some gaps. So I'm brushing the water across the surface and working quickly. And I'm going to drop in some very bright yellow, and also I've got some lemon and some of my cerulean, and that should make me a slightly different green. There we are. And then I might just drop in a couple of other colours and see what happens. A little bit of blue. Down in the foreground there'll be some more, be more vibrant down in the foreground, and at the moment all my vibrancy is at the back. So I've picked up one of my greens that's straight out of my palette. So if there's any texture, it's going to be at the front. It's going to be right in the foreground. I've got a little bit of raw umber I'm mixing into my green, and I'm just going to roll my brush around a bit. It's not a strong colour, raw umber, but it's quite cool, so it gives the effect of there being shadows. Now I'm going to mix, I'm going to use quite a dark green straight out of my palette, and I'm going to mix in some raw umber, so it's a very, very dark green, and I'm going to place it just in some areas around here at the front. You can see it's getting stronger and darker in the foreground. It's still running a little bit here. And I am going to use something with a sharp edge. In my case it's a palette knife, and I'm going to put some grasses in. So if you use something sharp when your paint is wet, the wet paint will run into it and give you dark grasses. Now if I leave this to dry, I'll be able to go back in and put some light grasses in by scratching out once it's all dried. Okay. Now I think I would quite like to make this foreground a little brighter. So to get a really nice lime green, I'm going with my turquoise and my lemon yellow. Oh, I'm not sure. Not sure I should have done that. I might lift some of that out. Let's see. Now I think I'd like to put a bit more detail in my background. I've got some more trees that I think I'd like to, more bushes. I want to make a bit more of, but I want that bluey mauve that I had. It's quite a nice colour to make. I'll put too much blue in now. So how do I tone it down? I put in a little bit of yellow. We'll tone that down into more of a mauvey grey. That's too dark. So let's water that down. Check colour. I think that's probably too purple. Let's put a bit more blue into it. It's looking better. It's much more of a grey, and I want it paler, so I'm going to water it down and let's see what happens here. I think that might be a bit better. So it cuts round the bushes, if you notice. I'm just trying to see where these shadows are. And I'm going to use it as a very thin glaze, so I'm going to add even more water to it. And I just want it to look back here, there's some shadow on the hills. So I want that to look like there's shadow. Up here. More shadow. Looking at where these little pockets of dark are. Doesn't have to be all of them. Well, I'm going to step back and have a look at that. Actually, before I do that, I'll just show you. You can make some little white marks as well. You really need to wait until it's dry. Mine's still a bit damp, but you can put some light grasses in there as well if you want to. Right, I'm going to step back and have a look. Right, so I still don't think there's quite enough intensity in this, because that's my focal point. So I'm going to go back in with a very dark green and quite a dry mix, a slightly smaller brush, just very damp, and I'm going to pick up the darkest colour that I've mixed, which is that very, very dark green. I'm just going to roll it. It's almost black, to be honest. In fact, I think I did mix black into it. So this is quite a focal point here, where this very dark tree is lit behind by the light, and there is still more of this. I'm going to make it a little bit wetter. I think for me that's a little bit better. And I might put a slightly brighter bush in there, using one of my greens. And the same sort of effect. Might even paint in some grasses down here. Add in a bit of detail at the front. I think that's it. I don't want to overdo it, and I'm not that keen on those marks I've just made, so I'm going to drop in a bit of water to fade that out. Right, and I think I'm done.